It looks like we've got a bit of after-lunch attrition or slow people coming in, or people slowly coming in. Probably not slow people coming in, that's probably wrong. I think the slow person's already here. This session, we are going to be talking about a couple of things, but I just want to get the panelists up here, if you can join me. And then just also say that a couple of housekeeping things. That tomorrow, the session that we were going to have on the, what's it called again? Preparation of the UN comment on drug policy and the effect of drug policy on economic and social development. That is not going to take place tomorrow because it's quite an important thing, so we're going to actually feature it in the closing plenary, talking about what messages can we take out of here to inform the United Nations comment. But it's all quite a mystery, these comments, and that nobody's quite sure how they come about or what they mean or how influential they are, but we'll discuss that a little bit on Friday. But I think it's a good idea to try and get something out of this that is concrete to carry forward. So in place of that, we will be having a meeting with the local drug action committees and the people that were in Monday's meeting with UNODC, so we can continue with those discussions. But there's a fantastic SANPUD and input joint session in the morning, which is also very good. So I just wanted to do that little bit of housekeeping. Jason, you're going to stay there or here?
I just didn't want to interrupt your speech.
Oh, I'm used to being interrupted. Yes, Michelle. In the board meetings, I'm used to being interrupted. Okay. So I must confess that my eyesight has got really bad, and the text on this is really small. So excuse me while I put these glasses on and try and read it. Right. I don't see Colleen here, but I wanted to thank Colleen for doing a very nice segue into, oh, there you are, into the session, which was planned, no doubt, and so thank you for that. So we're going to be talking about, in the session, be careful what you wish for is the title. Because often there's a very simplistic view that all we need to do is introduce better health systems to treat people, and we need to legally regulate drugs. Now, we've seen what happens with legal regulation in sometimes with alcohol, with nicotine in the past, with a lot of other products that are legally regulated, which somehow seems to think that let people think that they're safe now, when really there's an uber-capitalistic agenda behind it, perhaps. We've got to be careful of these things, and I don't want to take away from what the speakers are going to say, but these are some of the things we're going to talk about, as well as that relationship between the criminalizing of drug use and the criminalizing of sex work, which in South Africa, in the court position, there was a strong argument that drug use was one of the reasons why sex work should remain criminalized at one stage, which is a kind of weird argument, but anyway. So without further ado, I'm not going to take any time now. I'm just going to go straight into the speakers. And this is where I need the glasses and to try and work out what my notes say. So the first speaker we've got today is Simon Howell, Dr. Simon Howell. So Simon is going to bring quite an interesting perspective, because Simon was one of the people that wrote the court's position for the judgment in Cape Town, in the Western Cape High Court, which then went on to inform some of the other things, and it's quite an interesting approach that they took. So Simon is a senior researcher at the Cape Town, the Center for Criminology up at UCT, and I've known Simon for several years. He's got a PhD in philosophy. He's written some really interesting papers, right from the philosophy of drugs to, we've written a couple of papers together on the National Drug Master Plan and on the perpetuation of apartheid through drug policy, which are made more brilliant by Simon's input. I'm very grateful for him to be here today, and I believe his cannabis session was really interesting this morning as well. So, Simon, I'm not going to go through your whole blurb because I think your reputation speaks for itself, but over to you to start off. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can I have my slides? Because I may not know what to say without the slides. So, when Sean asked me to do this paper, it caused me somewhat of an existential crisis, because for the one part, when we wrote this, I was really busy, and we all put our bits in, and we submitted it to the courts, and it came back, and John Davies, the judge, thanked us for it and said it had been quite influential in his decision-making process. But after that, I kind of forgot about it, to be honest. And it's only when I was looking it up now that I realized that it actually had some impact, surprisingly. I just didn't know this. And it also caused me an existential crisis in the sense that I looked at it and I was like, but I used to write neatly then. What happened? Because why is everything so messy now? But I think messiness is part of the theme of here. I've called this presentation Cannabis Contrails. And contrails are, when a plane flies overhead, those like little wisps of cloud that it leaves in the sky? Those are contrails. Now, contrails are a useful metaphor, I think, because on the one hand, they show that no matter how loud and thunderous we roar across the sky, we've got to ask ourselves, what have we left behind? Has that changed anything? But also, I think it's a useful metaphor because contrails only form or appear in the right environment. In other words, no matter how loud you are or how much noise you make, if it's not the right environment, you won't leave anything behind. So for that reason, I thought contrails sounded like and it's something new. No one, I don't think, has used contrails before in cannabis, and it's got its alliteration. So as presentations go. So if I can have the next slide, please. So, we wrote this paper, colleagues and I, which was submitted to Judge Davies, which looked at essentially, the title was Balancing the Harms of Cannabis in South Africa, and it essentially made an argument as best we could at the time, which was quite a number of years ago, for the decriminalization of cannabis in some way. At that point in time, there was still up for grabs as to what that would look like. And we didn't really know what it would look like either, to be honest, but we thought, we ought to make an argument, and we put together what evidence we had, and we submitted it. Looking back, however, I think, we were right in some parts and we were wrong in some parts, and we didn't go for enough in another part. But I've sort of taken out the main themes from that paper, because it's very difficult to find online as well. We'll put it on the criminology website. I couldn't find it for few hours, for instance. So, we'll put it online if you want to read it. But there's always been, the key point about we were that the harms caused by cannabis are less than the harms of prohibition of cannabis. And moreover, you could even go further and to say that prohibition has created the very environment in which the harms occur in the first place. So that argument is sound, I think. But there is always this potential for understanding or what legislating based on harms, because there's always the concern that even though you don't intend it, the unintended consequence is that you end up creating more harm than good, whether it be for cannabis or whether it be for any other drug, or whether it be for anything else for that matter. And I think that is something that we've experienced, or at least seen hints of in South Africa with the current legislation, is that it's created such a murky context, it's created such a blurred policing context especially, that inadvertently, despite our best efforts, things haven't gone the way we wanted them to. So I think there is the recognition, at least, that there has been some failure here. And that's important because if we give up now, then there's no point to this. You need to keep looking for solutions, or at least to keep revising what has been done. And I think there needs to be an element of self-criticality or self-reflection in cannabis policy that is often not there. And I speak for myself as well here. Is that asking the hard questions to ourselves is often more important than asking the hard questions to other people. And of course, there is no objective platform from which to speak here. This is a platform, but it's not objective one in that sense. And there may be better or worse ways of doing things statistically or economically or socially, but there's no, I mean, we tend to, when we are discussing these things, get put into camps or groups, and we believe we have some sort of moral basis on which to talk and which to speak and which to overspeak other people, but in fact, I don't think there is actually a moral platform. There are better ways of doing things and worse ways of doing things, depending on how you define harm. If harm is death and harm is injury, then sure, there are better ways of doing things. But that's just one way of understanding it. I think unless we're self-reflexive and self-critical of our own involvement in policy making, we may have problems. Can I have the next slide, please? Oh, sorry. Aha. The biggest issue and the biggest failure of our paper and a lot of work we've done is that while we've moved legislation from sort of black and white, the Drugs Trafficking Act, in which there was drugs and there were no drugs, and people, it was very clear cut, we've entered into this vast expanse of grey, which pragmatically has created issues, especially in terms of policing. How do you police that which is sort of undefined in terms of the law? How do the police go in and engage with this type of thing? And unfortunately, as I'll speak to in a minute, policing is the primary and almost always sole response of this government to any issue, whether it be drugs, whether it be sex work, whether it be poverty. So unless we devise mechanisms to direct or guide the police, ultimately it's wishful thinking to ask for anything else. And that brings me to the second point, which is that the devil is always and always will be in the detail. It's easy to come up with ideas often, or it's at least easy to talk about the ideas, but how do you implement them in a way that is pragmatic and that is step by step, foot by foot, over time? In other words, in cannabis's terms, do we count, for instance, plants, or do we weigh them, or do we invoke principles of morality, or do we just ignore everything? How do we implement these things? And I think that's often in South Africa where we get stuck. Even the Constitution, it's got great ideas in it. How do you implement it? It's all well and good to say, you have the right freedom to do whatever, but unless you have economic potential, you can't really engage with that type of system. So in the same way, I think cannabis is kind of stuck, or cannabis debates in this country. Speaking to policing, I think it's important to acknowledge that, in South Africa, we tend to use the police for most things. That's a function of both capacity, in the sense that the police have more capacity than anyone else in comparison to other government departments, but also because of the way in which the South African zeitgeist is formulated, in which we tend to send the police to deal with things. Think about the gangs. The gangs would be a great example of sending in social development, health, and a whole lot of other education. But no, let's send in the police, and let's repeatedly send in the police, even despite the fact that it continues to fail. Same thing with drugs. So despite the fact that we have never had any success, we'll keep doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. I think it was Einstein who said that's a definition of insanity or something. But the police are just not the right tool for the job. That doesn't mean they don't have a role to play, but they're not the right tool for the job. Until we identify and capacitate the right tool for the job, we can't expect any different result. And we must also understand that the work of policing, often we scapegoat the police and the like, and having worked with them for a very long time now, I can say the work of policing is fundamentally structured by targets. Unless you change those targets, the police are not going to act any different. And that's not because they are somehow different from society, but because we all act in that way. If we have a job and we have targets, we have to meet those in order to remain employed. We can't expect anything else. So until you change fundamentally the structure and the focus and the target of policing, we can't expect them to do anything else. That, of course, doesn't excuse all the corruption and the targeting of drug users and stuff. I'm talking formally, but it does give us a hint at why we need to figure out a better way of doing things. And unfortunately, in the paper we discussed, I don't think we engaged with that enough. And I think, with the privacy bill and the cannabis debate as it stands now, the police have been often positioned as antagonists, as something that ought to be out of it. But unless we include the police in this, we're never going to get anywhere, because they're fundamentally the people who are going to do the government's job, or the governance of cannabis. Irrespective of whether we like it or not, for the foreseeable future, they will be the principal means by which governance is applied in this instance. So finally, talking about politics. Drugs remain drugs because they are illegal, and I think that's quite widely accepted. However, simply saying that legalization ought to be then the strategy, or that regulation is the strategy, presupposes a functional state, presupposes a state that can regulate these things in a manner that is effective or decreases the harm and the like. I don't know if South Africa has the capacity currently to do that, frankly. It's a hard question to answer, well, hard question to something that, not nice to say, but ultimately, if we look at case studies from other parts of South Africa's forms of regulation, it does not have the capacity to deal with this. So introducing something as complex as drugs, which has the capacity or the potential to go awry very quickly, is very dangerous. I'm not sure what the answer is then. I'm nearly done. The other point is that, in terms of policy discussions, unless they have some sort of pragmatic realization, it's pretty much just conversation. And I think it's something that I've been guilty of, and I think, papers I've written have been guilty of, is that unless we do something about this issue, pragmatically, realize some change on the ground, we're talking. And it's policy, and it's a policy discussion. And frankly, a lot of money gets spent on policy discussions, but the money could be used elsewhere. And I think we need to justify our time and our expense in terms of the broader picture. Is how do we effectively use the money that we are given or donated or funded to engage with the public in a manner that is actually useful and it actually produces change on the ground. So contrails, in other words. How do we maximize those? Finally, Jacques Derrida mentioned once that there are no drugs in nature. His argument was that the concept of a drug isn't necessarily political, that it's not in and of itself anything. We make the concept of a drug. We create the concept as a normative, moral, laden term that we utilize both to condemn people and to advantage people. And until we recognize that there's no neutrality here and there's no objectivity, we're automatically going to have a lot of presuppositions every time we have a conversation. There needs to be an acknowledgement that you can't use the word drug without invoking a whole range of social, psychometric, psychological meanings that come with it. When you call someone a drug user, you're not identifying that person in an objective, empirical way as a person who uses an illegal or banned substance. You're identifying that person in a normative way. You're saying you are something. And we need to recognize that. Because inadvertently, if we just have a response that says, well, you're not a drug user, we're not policing you now, we're using harm reduction, well, that still is normatively laden. No matter how empirical we may make it sound, it still has a normative dimension to it, and it still has is ultimately the basis for judgment. So, the concept of harm reduction, I think, has gone slightly awry as a result of us not acknowledging that normative dimension. Once upon a time, harm reduction was the in thing, Now, it's sometimes being questioned, and I think that's because we're finally acknowledging that there's more to it than this, that you can't just simply medicalize things, because medicalization leads to pathologization, which is exactly where we started when we started with the harm reduction thing in the first place. So, sort of to end off in my brief speech, I think there's a benefit here of hindsight, which I'm utilizing, which of course you can only get in hindsight. And I think, to sort of leave you with this idea that I don't think we have the answers to the questions right now that we are looking for. But we need to start by acknowledging how very difficult these questions are in the first place. Because at the moment, often we try and make things a little bit simpler so as we can produce some type of response or policy paper or whatever. But in the process, we lose a lot of the meaning and the dynamics that are involved. So yeah, it's been a tough day of reflection, but this is where we're at least in my mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon, for a very sobering overview. What was interesting for me when I realized that your position paper was really important was when Anant Grover came out here and from the Global Commission on Drug Policy. And he's a great human rights advocate out of India who was behind the how can I say, decolonizing of ARVs, I suppose, or in a way, and making them more available and breaking the patents because they were just unaffordable. And Anant Grover stood here and he commended the paper, and he said what he felt was really valuable about it was that actually the principles that he used in the paper could be applied to any drug. And the only thing that could stop the Zondo argument from being applied across the board is if by making a drug illegal, you are making it safer. And we know that is just simply not the case because of a lot of very practical reasons. But as you say, there's a big gap between the theory of it and the application of it. So somebody who knows a lot about application and theory is Myrtle Clark. I've known Myrtle for several years. She has gone through several metamorphoses in the way that she fights this ongoing, very personal fight against being criminalized as an individual, but also bearing in mind that she comes from a very middle-class, privileged background, and there are traditional growers and that out there who are suffering more than the person who just would like to have their joint after dinner in their private space. I've many times, not many, a few times, had my phone ring with Myrtle on the phone, ranting and raving about some idiocy of some person, and then she dissipates and has something really valuable to say at the end, and something which I respect. And she's certainly a person who's a perfect example of resilience to me. So Myrtle, with great respect, I invite you to come up and share your intervention for today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sean. It's been such a pleasure, as I was saying in this morning's discussion, it's been such a pleasure learning to get to know all of my drug policy colleagues over the years. You guys have been my pillars of strength when it comes to the bigger picture. It's sometimes very difficult to translate the bigger picture of drug policy through to the cannabis community on the ground. As Simon was saying, in September 2018, we got the Constitutional Court confirmation of the Western Cape judgment by Judge Davis that the continued prohibition of the personal use of cannabis within private spaces was unconstitutional. Now, the South African Constitutional Court judgment on that fateful day was both the best and the worst judgment, both at the same time. On an international level and in terms of how things are developing in cannabis legislative reform, we were the first country to put privacy first. That means putting people first, doesn't it? Our privacy is a human right. The prohibition of the use and cultivation for personal use within private places was declared unconstitutional, and certainly our Constitution protects our human rights. But, no trade. And this is when we come to the topic of our conversation today. Be careful what you wish for. Or as the lawyers would say, the law of unintended consequences. Now, with this privacy judgment, didn't we get what we wanted? Didn't we get our human rights? The trade in cannabis is in a free fall in South Africa, as Charity was telling us earlier. Many legacy operators, indigenous people and local communities have been left behind since the judgment. Those with the means to exploit the glaring lack of legislative change have done so in the last 5 years. The farmers in Pondoland hadn't sold any of their crops for the last 2 years. The recent Pakisa Action Lab, we sat together with the government day and night for 5 days outside Pretoria. It achieved little by way of resolving this huge issue that has to do with our rural farmers and our township carcinomic economy. The same is happening in other countries in Africa. Medical cannabis licenses are being granted for export, but the citizens are still being arrested in the street. Yes, Ghana, yes, Zimbabwe, and yes, a whole lot of other countries in Africa. Because what this is the neo-colonial capture of our cannabis. Because how can you be giving somebody a license to grow and export cannabis and then you arrest your citizens in the street? How can you be producing medical cannabis, which I always use in inverted commas, I prefer to say cannabis for health uses, while you are not introducing a program of cannabis for children with epilepsy in your basic health programs? What is that about, Africa? You should be ashamed of yourself. They're capturing your cannabis. How can you be doing this? This is something that really, really frustrates me with the rest of Africa. In a very ironic way, Fields of Green for All continues to fight for all in capital letters, including those who are making loads of money from cannabis. Of course, everybody wants it to be legal. But then even more ironic than that is that Fields of Green for All is the only cannabis relegalization non-profit company in South Africa, and we are the only non-profit company only dealing in cannabis who has ECOSOC status at the United Nations. So we are concentrated on cannabis. I use broader drug policy for my support and because I find it academically really interesting and because we have to be able to see the bigger picture in all of this. But I'm literally all about cannabis. And as my dear departed Jules always used to say, I'm not sick, I don't want to make socks, I just want to get high. So, you know. But ladies and gentlemen, all is not what it seems under the dagga tree, because it's not. We have this disparity. At the top, we have our cognitive liberty, which is a primal human right. At the bottom, we have this thing called stigma. How many times have we heard this word, stigma, stigma, stigma? So with the African countries who are granting these medical cannabis licenses, are you not stigmatizing somebody like me? Yes, you are. Because your adult use market, if you're talking economics, is the largest slice of the pie. The smallest slice of the pie is prescription cannabis, because particularly in Africa, nobody can afford that stuff. Really, we would say yesterday we're speaking about a CBD oil or whatever. You know, you can invest 1,500 Rand for a little bottle of drops of CBD oil. I'd personally rather drink a glass of water, but I like my THC. So cognitive liberty, stigma. We are inadvertently stigmatizing the largest part of the cannabis market while we are also extolling the economic benefits. And as I was saying this morning, and apologies to the people who also attended that one if I'm repeating myself, that one has to somehow stop stigmatizing. You know, we find that the cannabis communities themselves will stigmatize by saying hard and soft drugs. Thank you, the Netherlands. I believe that they introduced that dichotomy. So we find stigma for other drugs within the cannabis community, which is a very, very real challenge for us at Fields of Green for All. And then on the one side, we have the law, which is essentially the evidence. Now, unfortunately, in 2017, when we brought the trial of the plant to the Pretoria High Court, we were filibustered out of court and we ran out of time after 14 days, so that evidence has never been heard. In the Western Cape High Court, the two plaintiffs who sued the government shortly after us in 2011, their case came at the end of 2011, ours came at the beginning, decided that they wanted to exercise their citizens' rights and they didn't take any legal representation, despite this being offered to them pro bono. So their evidence was sorely lacking. And Judge Davis could see that, and that is why Judge Davis called on the likes of Simon to give context to that judgment that he was going to give. So the evidence has never really been heard because all we got was the best and the worst judgment, this whole privacy issue. Then Almost more importantly, on the right-hand side, we have this thing called hearts and minds and perceptions. And we heard from the UNODC that cannabis, the use of cannabis is a real problem, you know? And we heard in the judgment itself that the trade in cannabis is a problem in South Africa. That's why we weren't permitted to trade. So these perceptions go all the way from the man in the street who still sees cannabis as the gateway drug, and dacha is chacha. I don't know if anybody here in this room lived in Yeovil back in the days, in the 80s, and in the Checkers parking lot, it was spray painted across the wall. Dacha is chacha. These perceptions need to be weighed out with the evidence. And the cognitive liberty at the top and the stigma at the bottom gives us right in the middle our 10 crisis points. And this is something that I've been repeating over and over again, and it's a conversation that I even had at Harm Reduction International in Montreal in 2016. Because these crisis points are all enduring. And I won't take too much time with them, but I'll just race through them to give you a little picture of what our world looks like at Fields of Green for All. We have a legislative vacuum. Where is the evidence for the Cannabis for Private Purposes bill? What is the evidence about this plant counting? Why is 15 plants more harmful than 12 plants? And who is going to go to Pondo Land and stand on top of the hill, cross the river, climb the mountain, and go and count those plants? Really? Number 2, the ongoing invasion of privacy and autonomy. Well, you don't want to hear the nightmare that goes on in the police holding cells in South Africa. You really, I'm sure a lot of people here, particularly my colleagues from Sisonke, you know what it's like in those police holding cells. And the thing with cannabis is when the accused gets to court on the Monday morning, they invariably throw the case out. And you will never, ever, ever forget the smell on the inside of that holding cell. So we have divorce and custody issues and testing at work and school, and particularly in mining and manufacturing, in people who are doing largely manual labor. They test positive for cannabis in their urine and they lose their job. And that urine test does not test for impairment. That does not. Because if you test positive for THC, you could have had a spliff 2 weeks ago, and you still test positive. And so the most of the incidences that we have of people losing their jobs in this terrible South African economy is the province that is always neglected, that is always left out, that has the most incidents of people losing their jobs for cannabis is the Northern Cape. Why? Because they're busy mining the shit out of the Northern Cape, and everybody in the Northern Cape works in the mines, don't they? So when we see the maps of Africa of South Africa up on the screen, there's Western Cape, there's Gauteng. What about the Rastas in the Northern Cape who grow cannabis on the islands in the middle of the Orange River? Because none of them, because of their religious use of cannabis, none of them can get jobs in the mines. And I promise you, go to Pofadder and ask Aubrey Klutter in Pofadder how many times he's been arrested. It still carries on today. His late wife was actually got a stay of prosecution pending the outcome of our case. So there's lots of forgotten people within these crisis points. The plant counting I've already been through. It's a major bugbear of mine. Number 4, licenses in the Dacha Dompas, because, ladies and gentlemen, the laws against cannabis are the last apartheid law. It was introduced by the apartheid government, and it is still perpetuated by our so-called democratic government. So the scenario is that you prohibit me from using, cultivating and trading in this plant for 100 years. Then you give me a little concession, and you say, but you can come to me and get a piece of paper that will allow you to do this if you've got enough money. So that's why we call it the Dacha Dompas. And that is why licensing of medical cannabis in the rest of Africa is a human rights abuse. Number 5 is this official ignorance. I don't want to even begin to tell you how little the committee that is dealing with the Cannabis for Private Purposes bill in Parliament actually knows about cannabis. These these economic benefits. No, cannabis is not going to save the world. Sorry to disappoint you. But you just have to sit on my stoop at the Jazz Farm outside Johannesburg and you hear story after story of all these big entrepreneurs who've decided now that it's legal, they're going to get into cannabis. Millions and millions and millions have been lost on people trying to set up these huge big facilities, growing cannabis under lights using Eskom that we don't have, okay, using chemicals that really do harm our environment, and then once they've grown the weed, they've got nobody to sell it to because they do not have enough experience to grow cannabis to the EU GMP standards where they actually want to export this cannabis. So what do they do with all that cannabis? They send it out into the streets to be burnt in a series of small fires. Yeah. And what has destroyed our legacy cannabis industry and is continuing to wreak devastation is these licensed facilities not being able to get rid of their tons and tons of weed and actually leaking it out into our dear legacy illicit market. The cannabis industries that speak in vacuums and silos, I can't understand in this very, very important gathering of great minds who really, really get the issues of human rights and harm reduction and all of the issues that we've been discussing. I can't understand that we are the only people from the cannabis industry, Fields of Green for All here. I can't understand all the invitations that I sent out to people to please attend this so that they could understand the bigger picture. Nobody took me up on that invitation. So we have this silo thing, which I think is indicative of a lot of policy making in South Africa, not just cannabis. Industrial cannabis, you know, we know that the 1961 convention says for medicinal and industrial purposes. So now all of a sudden we've got countries like Zimbabwe who suddenly got a hemp industry. I mean, other than for domestic and small-scale use, we do not have an industrial cannabis legacy industry anywhere in Africa. We don't. And now it'll take at least another 20 to 30 years to get this whole new sector of industrial cannabis up and going, but it's being put forward as the savior. Because why? Because it doesn't make you high. There's no political party. We're faced with this dreadful election next year, and it was certainly in our faces at the Phakisa Action Lab, where we were meant to be formulating policy. And I still don't know who to vote for next year, 2024. Who knows? No political party will grow the balls to be able to say, we support cannabis law reform. And then this was something that we actually discussed in quite depth. It was really interesting this morning in our other Cannabis Africana panel, the fact that we're just not telling the youth the truth about cannabis. And if you can just start with the truth and you can start telling that to the youth, then maybe we can start unpicking some of this stigma. And we saw it last night with the UNODC, and I will be outspoken about this. Cannabis does not, there's no scientific evidence to say that cannabis damages the developing brain. That was Henry Anslinger, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah. This business about damaging the developing brain, let's forget this now, okay? The head of the cannabis department in President Cyril Ramaphosa's office started smoking cannabis when he was 14. I didn't start smoking cannabis until I was 19. So maybe my brain wasn't so damaged for the 6 years before I was 25 or whatever. So we've got cannabis business, of which there's gazillions of people all over the world merrily conducting cannabis business. And then on the right-hand side, we've got all the things. On the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, we've got cannabis business, and on the left-hand side, we've got Fields of Green for All. So, never the twain shall meet, ladies and gentlemen. It's very, very difficult for us as a cannabis legalization organization to put forward these really big concepts on the left-hand side. In the context of stigma, which is all pervasive, of ignorance on the part of our government, of neo-colonial capture all over the world. Go look at Colombia, go look at Mexico, go look at the great failed Jamaican medical cannabis experiment. Go look at the top-down vertical integration models that were first introduced in California and Colorado. In order to get a license, you had to be able to do everything, from the seed to the banky. You did everything, so you captured that whole thing. Then we find the terrible, terrible inequality. You go to the Cannabis Expo, which is held here in Cape Town, in Durban, and in Johannesburg, and you see it's all bling, 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 bling all over the place, and everybody's plying their wares, selling a bit of weed under the table, got all of their new gizmos and gadgets, but never a rural farmer to be found in the Cannabis Expo. And then the social injustice. Because, ladies and gentlemen, I was just saying earlier, when I was having a cigarette outside, another drug of choice, that unless the sneeman, now I'm not sure if you know what a sneeman is. Okay, a sneeman is the guy who sells the matchbox at the BP. Okay, so he's called a sneeman. Unless the sneeman still has the opportunity to put bread on the table, cannabis is not legal. There has to be some way of including the sneeman into this whole scenario. So we've got the drug treaties, we've got the objects and the purposes and the value and the social justice and all of this here, all of this that happens in our cannabis world. And right at the bottom, as the foundation for everything, we have this concept called Dacha private clubs. Cannabis social clubs is what they call them in Spain. And NCOD, which are the great drug NGO in Europe, they first initiated this whole thing of Dacha private clubs. And I've just gone through my 10 awful crisis points, crisis. But, ladies and gentlemen, you can't get what you want unless you know what you want. So that is why we produced this book. And it's called, I think I missed the last slide. Never mind. I'll just tell you about it. It's called Cannabis in South Africa, the People's Plant. A full spectrum, not CBD, a full spectrum guide for policy reform. It's a guiding document. And in here is the system of Dacha private clubs, the system of cooperatives, how to get rid of the police. Take the police and cannabis and separate them completely. Here's an answer to your question, Simon. Separate them completely, and in the middle, put the office of the cannabis ombudsman. And the bud is in capital letters, please. Okay. So the office of the cannabis ombudsman decides whether any harm has been done. So somebody comes, steals your weed, you go to the cannabis ombudsman and they say, that's criminal, you can't steal something like that. So you get reported to the police. But we have to have some sort of barrier between us and the police. In order to protect our privacy, we've got the Dacha private clubs and lots more concepts in here. This is available for a free download on our website, and we really are battling to have this heard. It's not difficult reading. It's just a guiding document for the government, but to date, they're not reading it. And if anybody's got any suggestions on how I can get them to read it and look at these very, very simple concepts in here, I really am open to suggestion. Another thing which seems to be a theme of Drug Policy Week is this whole idea of resources. It's incredibly difficult to keep going as a completely non-resourced NGO in South Africa. People see cannabis as a done deal. People see cannabis as something that's just easy to do. It seems that needle exchange programs and that type of thing, while not less important, are much more politically correct to support. So here's another request. If anybody has any idea how I can get hold of some money, then please let me know. Thank you very much.
So Myrtle has just proved that cannabis can be a great gateway drug to more effective drug policy. I remember once listening to John Maytham on the radio and Little saying, people say cannabis changes the brain. Of course it does, otherwise I wouldn't use it. I am one of the exceptions in that I have never smoked a cigarette and I've never smoked cannabis in my life at all, which is quite unusual considering the other things I have smoked. Right, we've got 2 more speakers, so we ask you some indulgence on time, and we're not going to get to all the questions in this session because I don't want to keep you beyond what's necessary, but I also would like to respect the time of the other speakers as well, because both of them have got very important things to say. Jason Eli is a colleague of mine that I've worked with for many years. Jason was the person that funded, when he was with UNODC, the very first consultation between people who use drugs and the Central Drug Authority. We had a series of 3 meetings where the CDA were allowed to bring 3 representatives from their committee, and there were about 30, I think, people who mainly living on the streets or in very insecure accommodation, came in and they sat down, and the CDA had 15 minutes and they had the rest of the day to talk to them. And we asked them a couple of questions. Why did you start using drugs? Why did you keep using drugs? Why do you keep using drugs? What has helped you to be more functional in your drug use, and what has hindered you and made your drug use worse? And that report is only now finding traction, and that started with Jason and a lot of other work with him. So Jason was with UNODC, he's now with the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. We've worked on some interesting papers together. Jason, I'm sure you've got some good insights on Canada and cannabis. He is Canadian, so thank you. Welcome. It's Jason.
Well, thank you, Sean. I would have to say that the value in that piece is down to the participants in those meetings. I just tried to help open space, and the value came from people like you and others who were in that meeting. So, I'm Canadian. Canada being one of only 3 legalized retail recreational cannabis markets in the world, the other 2 being Uruguay and Thailand. I don't include the US because technically cannabis remains illegal at the federal level in the United States. So even though they have a variety of states who have a variety of different approaches to cannabis, it's still entirely illegal according to the US government. I'm going to try over the next 10 minutes to just cover a few things that we've learned in Canada so far after 5 years of a legalized, regulated supply. Also, just to add to this, in addition to cannabis being legal for recreational purposes, the province of British Columbia has decriminalized possession of other drugs, other substances, opioids, methamphetamine, cocaine, you name it. And the province that I'm from, Ontario, is going to be doing the same early next year. So not only will we have a legal cannabis market for recreational purposes, you also will have decriminalized possession of all other substances. This is a way that the Ministry of Health is trying to respond to what has been a crisis, although I would define the crisis differently to the way that they define it. So, when I left home to get on the plane to come here, it's not the next, there we go. I walked through the airport, and here we have, just before you go through security, the normal session of please put your bottles, your recyclables, your waste, and oh, by the way, if you have any cannabis, it goes in this dispensary here. So you can imagine being the janitor at this airport when you have to undo the bins every day. Although, in fairness, the janitor at the airport can buy his cannabis anywhere, right? Where do I point this? There we go. So cannabis is ubiquitous. There are shops everywhere. These are just some shots taken from the street in Toronto. Mind the grammatical error there. But cannabis is widely available It's available for those who are 18 and over, and they have a limit of 30 grams a day of dried cannabis equivalent that you can have with you in public. You can smoke cannabis anywhere in public. Anywhere you can smoke a cigarette, you can smoke cannabis, use cannabis in the country. You can't use it in private spaces where also smoking is prohibited, so restaurants, bars, and things like that, but outside, no problem, in parks, etc. This is a map of retail stores in the province of Ontario. Ontario is the largest province by population in the country. And you can see there's plus 1,700. I say plus 1,700 because they're always approving new retail outlets. Only about 7% of those cannabis shops that have opened have closed. The vast majority of them continue on. In the country as a whole, it's around 3,700. The projection is they will slowly, the pace of increase will slowly decrease over the next couple of years, but it's clear there's still a lot of space in the retail market for cannabis retailers. In addition to going to a shop, you can buy it online. So let's all crash the Ontario Cannabis site, load up ocs.ca on your phone. You'll log right into the cannabis store and you'll be able to order home delivery of cannabis any way you like. They have a variety of products available. One of the challenges, which in fact I didn't list on the challenge slide coming up, was that when they started, they focused a lot on just the herb. They didn't think so much about edibles and other things. They decided that they would push that to the future, and that turned out to be a big mistake. So they've been playing catch up for a few years, and they're getting very close now to being on top of the market in that sense. So you check out, and just like any other website, Amazon or whatever, you get to the checkout page and they say, hey, we've got a great deal on this variety. The price has just dropped. Do you want to add this to your bin too? So here you can see that the price of wedding cake has dropped, and they're asking if you want to add that to your order. Then you just click through and pay, and it gets delivered to where you live. So some general points on this market. 70%, the government estimates through regular surveys that they do, 70% of Canadians purchase their cannabis now from legal outlets, storefronts, online, whatnot. Whereas prior to legalization, which was October 2018, that was around 9%. That 9% represents medical cannabis, and it was an extremely regimented and challenging regime at that time. Since cannabis is legalized, they estimate approximately a fifth of Canadians have used cannabis in the last year. And interestingly enough, one of the arguments against legalization was, well, we don't want young people to start smoking cannabis because, you know, the brain and everything, as if they weren't already smoking cannabis. And in some studies that are just starting to come out now, they've demonstrated that use rates haven't really changed among young people. Those who were using before are still using, and there's not been this rush to use among young people. People like me, older, there's been a massive push into cannabis use. Whether it's herb, gummies are a big thing, edibles of other kinds. So there's a really big push, particularly it seems in older Canadians, people who have health issues or people who are at a point in life where they're realizing that there is some value to them in consuming cannabis in one way or another. The government, it's been a windfall, as they expected, $1.6 billion in the last fiscal year for which information is available. And a lot of that revenue comes from the sale of either dried cannabis, extracts, or edibles. You can see that the total revenue is estimated for this year to be about $3.9 billion. So that's a lot. Canadian dollars is about, what, 10 to 1, Sean? Something like that, 10 rand to the dollar. So you can do the math. I found this interesting. Because the personal possession of cannabis limited in public is 30 grams of dried herb equivalent, how do I calculate that if I got a container of gummies, I've got some extracts, some vapes. The government provides you this very easy calculator on their own website where you can plug in the amounts that you have, hit calculate, and it'll tell you, do I have enough or have I got space to add a few more things to my pockets? Now, if you did get arrested on the street with more than 30 grams, which is entirely possible under the cannabis law, depending on how much extra you had, you would either receive a small fine, or if you've got loads and loads of it, you could be in prison for up to 14 years. So there is still the criminalization of possession, but in that sense, it's more targeting people who are trying to sell on their own. So even though this is legal and regulated, I'm not allowed as an individual to trade in cannabis. There's a single supplier, which is the government. So the government of Ontario, who is the single largest supplier of cannabis to Ontarians and to Canadians, is therefore, I think, in my opinion, the single largest drug dealer in the world today, given the size of the market. And all of producers, all those who are producing cannabis, and I'll speak about that in a minute, must sell to the government, who then supplies all of the retailers. The minimum legal age for cannabis hasn't led to an increase in use among youth. One of the interesting things and one of the challenges of cannabis in Canada is that although federally it was legalized and there was a structure created for the implementation of the legal market, it was left to the provinces to fill in the spaces. And that's because Canada has an interesting system where there's a lot of devolution of activities. Health, for example, even though it's federally regulated, is undertaken by and large by the provinces. So a lot of the decision-making around that is done at a lower level. So the age of use varies from 18 to 21, depending on what province you're in. And it's the same with alcohol, and it's the same with cigarettes. But a higher age of use or a lower age of use demonstrated no increase in cannabis use among young people. The greatest challenge, I think, is the issue of social justice when we look at legalization in Canada. Legalization was first discussed as a government position in the late 60s under the father of who is the current Prime Minister now, Pierre Trudeau. And at that time, they had decided that they wanted to pursue this position of legalizing cannabis, but ran into a series of political roadblocks, and the issue just died. Interestingly enough, 40 years later, his cannabis smoking ski instructor's son decided he also wanted to join politics, and he ran and decided on his own that one of his major platforms was going to be the legalization of cannabis. And that is how we got to where we are today. When he proposed this, however, there was a strong component of we must right the wrongs that have occurred under the criminalized regime for cannabis. And what he was referring to was the expungement of criminal convictions for cannabis possession and use, and a push towards an increase in diversity, or the assurance of diversity of suppliers and retailers to represent all communities, and also the inclusion of legacy growers. Now, sounds great when you're running for election, when you win, and it comes down to the point of how do we implement. A lot of this has been lost. And so there's been a failure to follow through on expungement. The government argues that when you're arrested for cannabis possession, it's not indicated in the criminal record what drug you were in possession of when you were arrested. And therefore, it's too hard. It's really hard. It's hard for us to do that, which is a ridiculous position for them to take. They have decided to sequester records by 2024, which means to isolate all of these conviction records, but not to expunge them, unfortunately. First Nations populations are an extremely important population in Canada, and they were told that they would be included in the entirety of this process to decide how this whole production, distribution, retail sales, et cetera, would be done, and they were excluded in the end. So you have a situation now where in the province of Ontario, you have Ontario regulators regulating who can sell cannabis, but on the First Nations reserves, you don't have a regulation, a provincial regulation or a federal regulation that applies there. So they have created, in many cases, their own regulations. So now you have three types of shops on First Nations reserves. Those that are set up by the First Nations and regulated according to their regime. Those that are set up by members of the First Nations that happen to get provincial regulation, even though it doesn't necessarily apply there. And then those that are set up by others who have no regulation. So it's a very peculiar environment. And then the issue of cultural diversity among retail store applicants. Vast majority of applicants are white, middle class, or somewhat wealthy, and live in the larger urban centers. I mentioned the diversity of provincial models. Finally, we had before legalization this thing called personal and designated production. So you could apply as someone with a medical condition of whatever kind to the Ministry of Health, and they would give you a license to grow cannabis. And you could grow however much was included in that license, and it varied according to how much cannabis you needed on a daily basis. After legalization, the number of these licenses, I'm talking about Ontario here, has increased significantly from a number of around 7,000 or 8,000 to 23,000. And it appears that a lot of these licenses are now being used for off-market cannabis grow-ops, for either organized criminal groups growing cannabis or others who want to continue to cultivate. I can't say if they're legacy growers or not, but are competing against those that are part of the legal market. Personal means I grow myself. Designated means I get you to grow for me. There's also the challenge, and I think you touched on this, Myrtle, was overproduction of cannabis by aggressive suppliers. So there's been a great push to really increase the volume of production, and that's led to a glut where demand hasn't really kept up with the volume that's being produced. The issue of THC inflation, I mean this two ways. First, there's a lot of shopping now for higher THC levels among consumers, and there's a lot of product mislabeling that is indicating a THC level that's higher that is in fact tested. So there's the appeal that you can buy this and it's 25% and testing might show 12 or 13%. On the other side of that, the illicit market, which still exists and will never go away, is competing with the legal market by producing higher THC levels. They're not adherent, they don't have to adhere to the regulations in place, and the ability of the government to enforce those regulations is extremely weak. So you can see I've listed the legal limits according to the government here for edibles and extracts. No THC limit for dried cannabis according to the government legislation. But edibles and extracts, edibles in particular, have really shot off with some coming out on the illicit market that are extraordinarily high in THC content. And again, there's a demand. They're just meeting a demand that can't be met in the legal system. I close with the issue that I call big cannabis. Similar to big pharma, and again, comes to what previous speakers have said. We're seeing an issue now in Canada of large corporations buying up smaller producers, smaller growers, coming in and taking over the production, the space, the products, the names, and really squeezing out smaller producers from the market as a whole. And I would say that if legalization was intended to pursue a social justice goal, which was one of its initial three goals, the other being generate revenue for the government, and the third being take the cannabis away from the illicit market, we're not achieving this at all. And I don't have to talk about the fragility of regulation, but the fact that the bigger a corporation gets, the more control it has, the more influence it's going to have at breaking down regulations that have been put into place. So I leave you with 2 points, maybe to provoke discussion, but I'll read them because the panelists can't read them. These are quotes by John Calkins and my friend Peter Reuter when they talked about should we pursue a legalized regulated market for some substances. And they said, legalization creates a monster that can ride roughshod over regulators and public health. And I would argue we're seeing the beginnings of that in Canada. Decriminalization would likely reduce substantially the racial inequities of drug enforcement without much increase in drug-related harms. So it's in a way juxtaposing the one versus the other. Can legalization work in Ontario, in Canada as a whole? I think yes, but I think we're at the point right now where the government has to really address these significant challenges that are beginning to emerge in order to avoid big pharma, big tobacco, et cetera, ruling the roost. So in closing, every international border you come to, again, this is our great government saying, hey, by the way, remember, you can't drive across to the US if you've got cannabis. Drop it in the bin. So, thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Jason, for those insights. I think that it's clear that this is not a simple path. Now, I want to raise the point of the struggle that's been going on between sex workers and decriminalization. Sisonke have fought this battle for quite a while. They've broken away from Sweat and continue to fight the battle in very under-resourced set of circumstances. But what they've achieved is remarkable, and I think it's a blueprint for a lot of other decriminalization kind of debates and discussions going on. They are undoubtedly my favorite partner within the Love Alliance, which we are partners with him in. So Zintle, who is their advocacy officer, but so much more, I welcome you to the lecture, and I want people to try and understand the similarities in the process, but also the differences in the process. Because one of the things that happened in the original court case, the Jordan court case, was they said you should not be able to decriminalize sex work because of the link with drugs and drug trafficking. And I'm still trying to quite work that out. I had to write a position for the court on that, which Simon, myself, and Jay Levy did, which is quite ironic that 3 white men wrote the position on sex workers for the court. But I think Jay lived for 18 months among sex workers in Sweden and looked at the Swedish model and pointed out some of the problems with it. I think that maybe a lot of the thinking that goes into governing policy around sex work comes from white males. And so white males have a responsibility to undo some of that thinking in some way as well. But obviously we could never replace the experiences of people who've had to live through the awful criminalization of sex work. And my question always is to people, at what point does sex become transactional? Because only sex I've ever known has been transactional in some way or another. Yeah. Anyway, Zintle, sorry. To my favorite partners in the Love Alliance, Sisonke and Zintle, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Sean. And I think just to add on the last point that you made, I mean, we're all sex workers in some form or another. You know, just because if you're not standing on Nugget Street or you're not, an escort, but in terms of, transactional sex, most of us have done it here, Exactly, and sex is, if it's consensual, a very pleasurable act. And so then we found that we're in a situation where we've taken a pleasurable act and we've criminalized it simply because it's an exchange of services and now I take money for it. at that point it becomes criminalized. So what I'm going to touch on today is our road to decriminalization. It's been a very long road, looking at almost 30 years worth of work. And yes, Sisonke National Movement is now, we are our own NPO, and we have kind of technically divorced from Sweat, but we definitely do work very closely with them. We are comrades in the struggle. Okay. All right, so just to talk on the current law in South Africa. So in South Africa, sex work was criminalized under the Immorality Act, or this was in 1957. And then it changed to the Sexual Offences Act of 1957. Now, this act was amended in 2007, but the sections that criminalize sex work still remain in that act. And so the act, the law, it criminalizes the buying of sex, selling the service, living off the proceeds of sex work. And I think I do want to emphasize that, because essentially my family or the children that I support through sex work are criminals under South African law. That's how it is. And so, but what we see in terms of the implementation of criminalization with sex workers, we see it through the municipal bylaws. And so that's where now we look at the intersectionality of it. And I do just want to touch a bit on, when we think about our key populations and strategizing on how we can address the health, socioeconomic issues, we have to think about it in an intersectional way. Because my experiences, depending on my gender, my race, my class, my gender identity, my sexual orientation, all of that is going to feed into my experience in the world. And so when we try to think about, well, how do we address these issues, we have to consider all of those things. It's not going to be a blanket approach. And it is going to have to involve uncomfortable conversations. We have to talk about race. We can't avoid it. We have to talk about class, as uncomfortable as it is. But in order to get sustainable or impactful solutions, we have to consider all of those parts that make you a person in this world. So back to the point on municipal bylaws, this mostly, if not only, affects street-based sex workers. And so if we look at the different types of sex work, street-based sex workers are the most oppressed. They are the most, they are the group of sex workers that are exposed to the most violence. And so municipal bylaws, so we're talking about loitering, solicitation, and we don't just see that here in South Africa. All countries really that criminalize sex work, when you look at implementation, it comes through in the municipal bylaws. And so, our question here is that if we look at the 1957 Act, which criminalized sex work, interracial relationships, and same-sex relationships, once we moved into a democratic South Africa, same-sex and interracial relationships, they were decriminalized. But why is it that adult consensual sex work can still remain in a democratic South Africa, and that it can still remain under this beautifully written constitution that is supposed to inform all other laws in the country? Why is that still the case? And so that's really the basis of our advocacy for decriminalization. All right, so we have 4 legal models on sex work. I could make a whole workshop on that, but I will be brief. And I think I do just want to highlight that so that we can see the differences with these 4 legal models. So the first one is where we are now, which is full criminalization. So this is where all aspects in the sex work industry are criminalized: the seller, the buyer, brothel keeper, living off the proceeds. So that's where we are right now. Then the next one is partial criminalization. So this is also known as the Nordic model or the Swedish model. Now, under this model, buying sex, yes, is criminalized, but selling sex is not. So the client is criminalized in this system. Now, the thinking behind it was that, okay, so if we're saying that sex workers are the ones that are more exposed to violence from law enforcement, from clients also, let's decriminalize them, and that'll make the industry safer. That was their thinking. Now, obviously, with the research that's been done, especially from NGOs and sex work-led organizations, that's not the case. Sex workers are still exposed to violence, to stigma and discrimination. And so this legal model, it doesn't make sex workers' lives easier in any way. Then the next one here is legalization. Now, the thing is, for this one, we have to remember that legalization of sex work and full decriminalization of sex work are not the same thing. The terms are used interchangeably, but there are key differences there. So, under legalization, the buying and selling of sex is legal, but it's under very strict laws and regulations. So, I like to use the example of Senegal. So in Senegal, sex work is legalized. And one of the regulations that they have is that they say that all sex workers need to carry a card that allows them to work legally. And in order to have that card, you need to go for regular HIV testing. So this is a regulation that's only targeted at sex workers. The other citizens aren't required to walk around with what is essentially itompas, if we're going to be honest. And so, again, the thinking behind that with the policymakers was that, well, this is going to encourage more sex workers to get tested, and so that's going to decrease infections. But, again, if you do the research, if you go to sex work-led organizations on the ground, that's not the case. The HIV infections have not decreased. We still have stigma and discrimination in healthcare facilities. Now, if I, as a sex worker, have to go to a clinic, and I go to that clinic, and I'm already shamed in the clinic by the nurses and being called umahosha, you're selling your bodies, you're immoral. Am I going to go back to that facility? I'm not. And so having all of these regulations, it still doesn't address the stigma and discrimination that sex workers face. So then you'll find that a lot of sex workers are still going to be working, because it's our job, but now we are still working as criminals if we are not following the strict regulations, targeted regulations that are put in place. Another example is the red light district. So I mean, this is a huge tourist attraction. Everybody, you want to go to Amsterdam, you want to go to the red light district. And so from the outside perspective, you think, okay, well, here is a place where sex workers can work. Surely this is great for sex workers. But the thing we have to remember is that now sex workers are limited to work in one space. And in the nature of sex work, you go to where the clients are. You can't expect all of the clients to come meet me in this particular street. If I have clients that live in a different town, I should be able to go there and to do my business. So again, you see these regulations that are specifically targeted at sex workers, and in the implementation is still used unfairly against sex workers. And it still contributes to stigma and discrimination. So then we get to the one that we love, full decriminalization. So full decriminalization, it's the only human rights-based and inclusive approach to sex work. So inclusivity here is a very, very important one, because what we're saying is that we want to be included in the existing laws of the country. Because for the arguments about human trafficking, there is an act that addresses human trafficking. If sex work is decriminalized, it doesn't mean that that act is going to fall away. Same thing with the Children's Act. We have the Children's Act there. If sex work is decriminalized, it doesn't mean that now we're going to allow minors who are under 18 to enter the industry. And I do have to add that there are under 18s that enter the industry. And sex workers have identified those places where children are being exploited. But out of fear of being arrested, if I can identify that there are children that are being exploited, how do I then go to the police and report this without stating that I'm a sex worker and risk me being arrested myself? So you see how there's so many opportunities for us to really tackle huge social issues, but it has to be inclusive. Sex workers need to be included in that. So yes, so this is what we really are pushing for full decriminalization. So looking at the milestones that Sisonke and I'll say the sex work sector as well has achieved. So this is the timeline of the successes that we've had. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do want to highlight that we have support from COSATU, the biggest trade union, that is also supporting decriminalization of sex work. They had sent a submission to the Law Reform Commission in support of decriminalization. We also have had support from the ruling party where they have, if I say support, they have put it as a resolution. Decriminalization is put as a resolution. But now we're saying that in the conference that you did, you have supported and endorsed the resolution for decrim, but you're the ruling party. Why are we not seeing decriminalization? Why are we not seeing it being prioritized there? So then it becomes, is it all talk and no action? Are you then coming out publicly and saying that we support decriminalization because it makes you look good? But what actually happens with actually putting in the work in order to achieve it? Yes, so these are just some of the other highlights. And so in 2016, there was the first launch of the National Sex Work HIV, TB, and STI Plan. This was very, very successful. So we have a policy that is endorsed by the government and through civil society and SANEC, where decriminalization is mentioned multiple times in that plan, that decriminalization is a very important aspect in addressing the health issues within the sex work industry. So again, we have it there in policy, it's written down. But why is it that decriminalization has been there's such a pushback from the government, which I'll get into in a moment. But you see, it's in this National Sex Work HIV, the plan. It's also included in the Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Plan that was recently launched. So the government is saying, yes, we understand that decriminalization is important in order to address gender-based violence and femicide. So it's there. They know about it. They know how important it is. But why is it not being prioritized? And so then we get to 2022. So this is really where the journey of the decrim bill started. So through the support of the Department of Justice, who did a series of consultations in the provinces, speaking to sex workers and also those that were anti-sex workers, just to get a sense of what are the communities saying. So this is a really good chance for sex workers themselves to give input in terms of what do we want in this bill? What does decriminalization look like for us? So before I get into this, so the bill, it's a pretty simple bill. It has three main asks. It says that you must repeal the section in the 1957 Act that criminalizes sex work, repeal the section in the 2007 Amendment Act that criminalizes sex work, and then also remove anybody with criminal records under the National Act. So we still haven't addressed the issue of municipal bylaws. And the thing is that with this decrim process, there's always the question of, but what about the bylaw? What about the regulations? What about the regulations? And what we're saying is that you can't regulate a criminalized industry. There's no way that you can come up with effective regulations if we are still criminalized. So here is just an overview of the law reform process. So where we are right now, I can't use the laser. Okay, anyway. All right, so we are at stage 6, where the bill is considered by cabinet. So we are still in the process here, and if it is approved, then it'll be sent into Parliament yet. So in these processes, from about step 1 to about step 6, we've also had certification from the socioeconomic impact assessment study. And there was also the process where, so just to take it back a bit. So 2022, the Department of Justice called for submissions for the DCRIM bill. And the deadline for that was the 31st of January 2023. So as soon as this came out, and it came out in around December, then it was a challenge of we need to get as many submissions as possible before meeting the deadline. And so the submissions, they were sent through. There were some challenges with that, which I'm going to get into. And so after receiving all of those submissions, the DOJ looked at the submissions, and then they also got a legal opinion from the state law advisor. So the state law advisor looked at the bill and said that it does not meet constitutional muster. Yes. So the state law advisor's opinion, it stated that the bill doesn't meet or pass constitutional muster because it doesn't include a framework for regulations. So now we can see that the fact that we haven't included regulations in the bill, now it seems like it's not constitutional. But again, our argument is saying, how do we discuss regulations if you have not given us that first initial yes? We need to get that foot in the door before we can have an effective conversation about regulations. And even when we do get to that conversation about regulations, it has to be led by sex workers. We want to avoid a situation where we have government officials and policymakers that have no idea about the sex work industry, trying to make regulations on the industry, because then you'll find a case where it's possible that the government will move towards legalization. And as we've already seen, and research has already showed, that legalization, the research shows that it doesn't have a positive effect for sex workers' lives. And so that was the state law advisor. Now, there was a short time frame for getting the submissions by the 31st of January, because we could only send our submissions either via email or by post. Now, we already know the post office system in South Africa. And so then it's like, okay, well, sending it by mail or by post may not be the best idea, so we have to go through emails. Now, even with that, they would not count submissions, multiple submissions, coming from one email address. So it had to come from individual email addresses. So when we then went into provinces and we had the consultations with our members, a lot of them we found didn't even have email addresses. So then we had to go and help them to create these email addresses. So you can already see that with all of those conditions, it leaves out people that don't have access to email addresses. So it's only the privileged people that can access or they are able to have a voice in this law reform process, and there are so many people that are left behind. So that was one of those big challenges. And so what we want is that we want to get to the second round of submissions, which would be when the bill goes into Parliament. Then there'll be a second round of submissions, and this is really now, we've learned our lessons from the first round of submissions. So now we want to use those lessons into the second round of submissions, but we need to get that opportunity. And so we want to push to go past stage 6. That's what we're really pushing for now. Now, in terms of let me go back. Right. So, after stage 6, which is the introduction of the bill into Parliament. And then we would go to stage 8, which is tagging. So tagging means that they have to basically categorize the bill. So that hasn't happened yet, but it is most likely that we are going to be categorized as a Section 76 bill. Now, what that means is that this is a bill that will also affect provinces. So, if it's a Section 76 bill, then if the bill passes the National Assembly, it still has to go to the National Council of Provinces if it is categorized as a Section 76. Now, this is where our provincial legislatures come in. So, going back into some of the work that we've done, the KZN legislature endorsed resolutions. They hosted a sex work symposium, and the first symposium where the legislature endorsed the resolution that sex work should be decriminalized. And really what we want is we want other provincial legislatures to look at what KZN has done, because they did a really powerful thing with the symposium where they invited sex workers and government officials and all other key stakeholders. And sex workers, we had the opportunity to speak to these people and to really talk about what is happening in my life. How does criminalization affect my life? And it was so powerful because it's one thing to get this information, from a researcher or, somebody with that kind of position. And I'm not even... I'm not saying that the work that they're doing is not important. It's definitely important. But for us, Sisonke, as a movement, we want to empower sex workers to take the lead in advocating for decriminalization, because ultimately decriminalization will affect their everyday lives. So if we get to stage 8, then we would be a Section 76. Then, if the bill it passes the National Assembly, it would go to the National Council of Provinces, and even after that, we have to bring the municipalities into the conversation. So this is where we have to talk to the councillors. And so in all of our lobbying efforts, all of these people are our targets. So how do we access the other provincial legislatures? How do we access the councillors and the mayors? Because then once the bill is passed at a national level, we also need to get those players to be on our side in order to see a positive implementation of this act. Okay, so these are the challenges. Right, so another thing that I do want to add is that in this whole process, we have realized that the government and departments of justice and the state law advisor and all of the instrumental people in this process, they still are working with their own biases. They don't leave it at the door. And so that's when you'll find that all of those personal biases come into how they interpret decriminalization of sex work. And it's unfortunate because then you'll find that they will use their own procedures and processes to suppress this bill. And so then our big job is, how do we then sensitize them? How do we get them to really understand what sex work is, and to give them the correct information so that they can make an informed decision? It's a challenge because even getting invited into those spaces is difficult. And even when you get a seat at that table, am I able to speak at that table? Because it doesn't help that I'm sitting at this table and I'm silent. I need to have a voice at that table. So how do we do that? That's also been something that's been quite difficult for us. So some of the things that we have done, we recently marched to the National Department of Justice offices in Pretoria, and we handed over a memorandum to the minister. So we marched in the streets of Pretoria. Here you see. Yes, so here's our director, Ms. Kholi Buthelezi, who was at the front lines, and here she was reading the memorandum, and it was also signed by Steve Letseke, the chairperson of the Civil Society Forum. And we, in that memorandum, Minister Lamola was supposed to respond within 5 working days. He has not responded. Crickets. Which isn't really surprising, but that's the thing, is that we know that he hasn't responded, but we have to keep the pressure going, because it's the Department of Justice that initially introduced the bill into Parliament. And so we still need their support to prioritize this bill. And so we have issued another letter to Lamola, and we're saying that we need to prioritize this bill before next year's elections. Because if this bill does not pass before 2024, the 30 years of work that we have done, we have to start from scratch. And that means another 30 years. And within those 30 years, how many more sex workers are going to get killed? How many more are going to be raped? So it's a matter of urgency. Our lives are at stake here. And so we need the Department of Justice and other departments, because to address issues, intersectional issues, it needs a multi-sectoral response. There's no way that the Department of Justice alone, or the Department of Health alone, or social development alone will address these issues effectively. They have to, I mean, if I can use the term, an orgy. They have to get into an orgy, really, in order to come up with these decisions, you know, and to come up with these solutions. So those are some of the things that we've also been doing, and it has to be a continuous thing. I think as you know, everybody knows here, if you're an activist, you know that the work will always continue, as tiring as it is, but we have to keep going. And so our next steps is to put pressure on the Department of Justice, because they're the ones within cabinet that should really be pushing for the bill to be prioritized before the 2024 elections. We are also prioritizing education on the 4 legal models, because what we found is that government has been looking at what other countries have been doing, and our fear is that they're going to be leaning towards the Swedish model and not full decriminalization, which isn't going to, it isn't going to give us the solution that we want. We do want to also register with the National Economic Development and Labour Council, or NEDLAC, and so we think that we are saying that sex workers work, and so we want it to be recognized in an official space. And of course, we want to strengthen, you know, our support from the region. If we have SADC also talking about decriminalization, or the African Union and UN bodies, I think that if we have pressure from the global spaces on the South African governments to say, what are you doing about this? Then this will also give them the pressure to prioritize our bill. Okay, and then I just some closing remarks. I do think that in terms of people who use drugs, needs to be included in the civil society forum. A lot of our achievements were through that inclusion in the civil society space. And so when we talk about law reform for people who use drugs, that is a seat that we need. We need to get included at that table in an effective way. And so law reform isn't effective if we are still living in a criminalized system. So the policies are there. It says that we need to decriminalize. Let's see the action behind it. And we continue to call for the government to give us the first yes. Give us the first yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to all of the speakers. I think that it's a really convoluted road to decriminalization. Well, actually, I think we make it a lot more complex than it needs to be. So I can summarize it very simply. Just stop arresting people. That's it. You don't need any legal change at the top or anything. If you just stopped arresting people at the lower levels for problems which are essentially not problems often, or are just socially constructed problems, or really just another way of criminalizing poverty or certain groups of people. If we just stopped arresting them, we would see a massive difference already. and we could take that money and put it into community development again. Okay, so we obviously don't have time for questions. It's ironic that I'm the person that always talks about time, and it's my session that has gone way over. I think take away some of the messages from today. I think that the work that everybody here has done is amazing, but in particular to Zintle and Myrtle, and your passion came through in this as well. Let's go forward. Let's understand that these are real people that we are talking about. This is not theory. And my solution to everything is put people in front of people. We're going back to our theme, put people first. Yeah. Thank you. Just an announcement. Some of the videos are already going up, and there will be some photos put up as well on the website. So you can tweet about it and add the hashtag in it, Policy Week 2023 or African Policy Week 2023, depending on how much space you've got. Okay. Now that you've got X number of letters or whatever it is, what's it? Who's invading my phone with an X? Okay, thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow morning. Remember, there are basically 2 sessions tomorrow morning. We're starting off with, we've got the very exciting input and sandput one, and then the municipality one as well, which will also be exciting in a different kind of way, though. All right.